This is 20 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility. My guest is Frank Graves, principal at the research and analysis consultant Brattle Group, and co-author of Brattle's new paper, Wildfire Financial Risks for Utilities, Proactive Management, Regulatory Policy, and Strategy Recommendations. Frank's going to describe Brattle's proposed approach to the challenges of utilities, regulators, and customers face from increasingly severe wildfire impacts. For over 3 decades, Frank's worked with utilities in forecasting, valuation, and risk analysis of issues ranging from generation procurement and planning to cost recovery. He's testified before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, state regulatory commissions, and in state and federal courts. He currently specializes in utility regulatory, economic, and risk management issues. And there's no bigger risk management issue, I think, these days than wildfires. Frank, the costs and risk of wildfires are imposing a really wide range of legal, legislative, regulatory challenges, and they're hitting utilities hard. We're going to talk about Brattle's 6-part package deal to address those challenges. But first, can you outline them and describe the most critical of them?
You mean in regard to the challenges? What's framing
Yes.
the
Yes.
problem?
Just the problem to start with, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, in one way, it's quite kind of evident just from the popular press that there's been a growing frequency of extremely severe and highly damaging wildfires. Their frequency and their size seems to be escalating, and that's, by most people's thinking, a byproduct of global warming, which is continuing to plague us in a lot of ways, weather problems all around the world. But there are some other elements that are a little less apparent, but quite relevant. For instance, not only are there more fires, but there's more people now living in the boundary of urban and rural settings, which is called the Wilderness Urban Interface, or WUI region. And so now when fires happen, there's more property at risk and more population at risk. And in addition, it appears that the liabilities that arise from those kinds of damages have also been escalating rapidly because court awards have been getting larger and larger. So one is the cost and risk problem is growing. The other is the problem is just massively difficult on the preparation and prevention side. Many of the utilities that have had fire issues have tens of thousands, possibly 20, 30, 40,000 miles of transmission lines, which are necessarily carrying high energy power and are vulnerable to mishap if there's brush material or things like that that are blown into them. So protecting all that territory is very difficult. Insurance prices are going up rapidly, and even insurance availability is going down as the community that normally would bear this risk is also finding it very tough to swallow. And then on top of that, there's a lot of budgetary pressures on utilities for other reasons that make it hard to ask for and gain all the monies that it would take to fully address the problem. So it's kind of a squeeze in all directions.
And it's tough. I live in the northeast corner of Los Angeles County. I wasn't immediately affected, but I saw the city burned down in January. And just recently, a report came out that while everybody had been talking for months about this particular sparking in a rural, sort of a woodland area that was the cause, just recently we found out that there were all kinds of problems on the distribution system before that sparking happened. What I'm trying to describe is the complexity of even identifying causes. But let's get into this a little bit further. The paper makes an interesting conclusion. It says that wildfire threats, because of all those things you just described, can be considered a set of costs that can be reduced, but not eliminated. So what does that mean for utilities, for people who live in wildfire-prone areas or wildfire potential areas, which is a much bigger area these days? And how do utilities and their regulators apply that insight?
Yeah, in a funny way, it sort of might seem obvious, but this is a viewpoint that isn't commonly expressed in regulatory proceedings to think about what to do about fires. But the basic issue is it's just too big to make it go away. The budgetary things that would be required would be gigantic, and utility companies are really power companies, not fire prevention companies who happen to deliver power. So they're necessarily constrained in how much resources they can throw at the problem. And even when they do, it takes time to achieve um, mitigation efforts over several years. And then there's just diminishing returns to any risk. Comes a point where it's harder to chip away at it more than it costs to do so, or that the the cure is more expensive than the disease in a sense. And we already recognize that in lots of places in utility practice. For instance, we don't try to have perfect generation reliability, but we set up power systems so that they have low probabilities of outages such that we could tolerate a few hours every 10 years of outage, for instance. And that's deemed to be a place where the marginal benefits match the marginal cost. Every risk has that character, and this one is particularly nasty because it doesn't happen steadily over time like power reliability is an hourly recurring problem. Instead, it happens sporadically in ways that are also extremely hard to predict and foresee. So you can do some things to reduce the likelihood of a fire outbreak, although that also you can't eliminate, but you can't really control the consequences either, because if one happens and there's Santa Ana winds or extraordinarily dry conditions in the spot where the outbreak occurred, these fires can consume football fields of land in a matter of minutes. So it's a huge problem. And what that means is that the best laid plans that utilities could come up with, and that everyone condones and supports, are per se going to leave some risk unaddressed. And that ought to be something everybody makes explicit up front, that we're not going to make this problem go away. What we have to have is a mechanism for coping with it. And there are various places along the chain from preparation to response where you can help improve the circumstances.
Okay, let's get into that. One of the classic example that I've seen in my reporting over and over is whether you should underground lines. Um, if you could afford to underground lines everywhere, all lines, maybe that would be a solution, but then you'd have to pay for it, and the customers really don't like seeing the cost of that and the rates. So what do? You got to bury some lines and not bury others. But I want to dig into this part of it really deeply, and it's going to take a little bit of time. Um, your paper proposes that what can address wildfire liabilities is a six-part package deal, you call it. So what are those six parts, and how do they fit together as a way to address future wildfire risks?
Sure. Thanks for asking. The six parts really span the whole supply chain or process chain of going from risk assessment to thinking about how big a problem might we be facing, to all the way through mitigation, insurance, funding mechanisms, and response mechanisms. And at each link in the chain, what you have done at that point is either made necessary or made different in character by what you've done in another link of the chain. So they're very codependent on each other. Each link affects how much is needed downstream or how much remains to be done. So that's the reason we're calling it a package deal. Is it's nice to think about this as a suite of six things you should do in relationship to each other, rather than as what's more commonly been the case of utilities sort of patching on improvements here and there to their approaches and hoping to get regulatory approval, which they often do. But in so doing, they don't create a narrative that says we have a systemic approach to this that is integrated and that you, our stakeholders, understand and buy into. So that's the broad outlines of it. I can go through the elements of it if you'd like.
Oh, I was wondering if you could give us some examples. I mean, part of it, I'm just looking at a list of the terms: actuarial analysis, wildfire mitigation, value at risk tolerance decisions. Well, right there, you've got what's the value of some sort of a decision, um, and how much is the risk? Well, that goes back to how much wildfire mitigation do you need and how much analysis do you have out where the wildfires occur? I was just, can you give us some examples? I'm just taking a stab at it to just get you to understand what I'm thinking about.
Sure. Well, the upfront step that you would expect, and that everybody does to varying degrees, is what I'm calling an actuarial risk assessment, which is basically saying what is the possible losses we might experience on our system from wildfires under the kinds of statistical evidence we have for how often they occur and what their character is. And what we'd like to get is what are called loss exceedance probabilities, which says what's my chance of losing at least this much money with a given probability. And that's sort of what is the basis ultimately for how the insurance industry operates. And in fact, they're often the source of this kind of analysis. But what you'd like to be able to do is take several snapshots of what your risk exposure is, because it's a very hard problem.
Yeah.
For instance, if you use historical risk patterns to think about it, those might be informative, but the risks could be getting considerably worse. If global warming, for instance, is happening and the other things I mentioned before, like the WUI population is changing, then just your historical incidence patterns are not enough to fully understand what's going on. And the forward projections are quite difficult. So it's a good idea to do that with, even when you're doing risk analysis, do scenarios of risk analysis. And then what you want to think about is what's the expected loss across all the range of possible sizes of loss and probabilities. And also, what are the size and probabilities of the worse than average cases? Because really, those are mostly what are the terrifying part of the problem. The average loss from most fires is pretty small, but once in every few years, or in hopefully hundreds of years of utility operating experience, you get something that's a multi-billion-dollar damage. And so you have to be preparing not just for the average, but for the worst case. So first is, what is our exposure? Once you've got that, you can start to say, okay, what's the second step? Well, they have to do mitigation planning. And that includes the types of things you already mentioned, like you could be doing hardening and you could be doing shutoff protocols and so on. There's conductor wrapping and various kinds of monitoring improvements that can be done. All of these cost a lot of money. So you have to reach some agreement on how hard to try and how much it can accomplish and how soon, in terms of chipping away at that risk distribution that we just assessed in our actuarial part of the problem. So you'd like to say, and what you'll discover is, again, you can't eliminate the problem, but you can, with mitigation, make it go down gradually in the future. So it's still going to be there, but it might be dampened over time. And what we're aspiring to here is not just a set of things that would be useful to do, but an agreed plan that can become the standard for or defining prudence after the fact. The goal being to say, we want to be graded on effort, not on outcomes, because again, we can help reduce the chance, but we can't reduce the possible harm very much. And so let's get an agreement on what efforts we're supposed to do and and the funding that it requires. And you should try on different sizes of effort in that regard, because if you could get a lot more out of it by spending more, you should. But you have to get agreement. This is spending customers' money to provide in a way, a secondary service to power. It's not what they're asking you to be, but you have to do it to make sure you can provide the power. So that's the second step, is mitigation planning with a goal of setting standards for prudence. And then you want to start doing what we call the value at risk analysis. And this is basically to say, what is our financial tolerance for what's left over? We know there's a total risk distribution. We think we can chip away at it with mitigation, but there's some left over. And what we want to know is, how much of a bad case can we handle versus not handle? And then what you want to do is say, okay, if we have some notion of there's a threshold that we don't want to go beyond, now we need to look to see if we can insure against that. And I'll just say one quick thing about that, that when you choose these thresholds, they're not intrinsic to the risk itself. That is, they're not based on saying, oh, this much risk we can eliminate for this much cost. What you want to do is say, what would that size loss do to the rest of our company if we had that problem? Not how hard is it to solve, but what are the side effects of it? Because really, even if you buy insurance, you still have the same problem. You've just decided to pay for it over time in a different way than if you didn't insure it, right? So the goal here is to say, what are the limits of our ability to operate financially around this problem? And so we want to do this assessment.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.